The line between human and animal isn't as defined as we think. I've lived on both sides of that line. When I was 6, I watched bandits slaughter my family on the Oregon Trail. Covered in my mother's blood, I lay motionless among the dead until they left. That night, as the mountain cold crept in, a grey wolf approached, not to feed on the remains but to investigate the one heartbeat still drumming beneath the canvas and carnage. By morning, I had left humanity behind. By the time Thomas Reed found me 7 years later, I couldn't remember my name or speak a word of English. Some call my survival miraculous. I call it the education that made me who I am. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Miller family wagon creaked westward along the dusty trail, the summer of 1847, bringing both promise and peril as they journeyed toward California's gold fields. Jacob Miller, a former blacksmith from Pennsylvania, had sold everything to finance this journey west. His wife, Sarah, mended clothes in the back of the wagon while keeping an eye on their son Ethan, who had recently celebrated his 6th birthday somewhere in the Nebraska Territory. "Stay close to the wagon, Ethan," Sarah called, as the boy chased butterflies along the trail's edge. "Don't wander where I can't see you." The Millers had joined a larger wagon train in Independence, Missouri, but as the journey progressed, the group had gradually splintered. Some travelers moved faster, others slower, and disagreements about routes had further divided them. 2 weeks earlier, the Millers and 3 other families had broken off to follow a supposed shortcut through the mountains that would save them nearly a month of travel time. Jacob had his doubts about the detour, but deferred to William Fletcher, a confident man who claimed to have made the journey twice before. Now, as their 4 wagons wound through an increasingly narrow mountain pass, those doubts gnawed at him more persistently. "We should have stayed with the main group," Jacob muttered to Sarah as he surveyed the steep cliffs surrounding them. "This pass feels like a trap." "William knows what he's doing," Sarah reassured him, though her voice lacked conviction. "We'll rejoin the main trail in a few days, and we'll be ahead of schedule." That evening, as the small caravan made camp in a sheltered clearing, Ethan played with the Fletcher children, while the adults discussed their dwindling supplies. The shortcut had taken longer than expected, and game had been scarce in these mountains. "We'll hunt at first light," William announced, his authoritative tone brooking no argument. "There's deer signs all through these woods. We'll have fresh meat by noon tomorrow." Jacob nodded along with the others, but something about the location unsettled him. They were too exposed, too isolated. He checked his rifle before turning in, something he hadn't done since the plains. Dawn broke with a heavy mist clinging to the mountainside. Jacob woke early, disturbed by dreams he couldn't recall, but that left him uneasy. He stepped quietly from the wagon, careful not to wake Sarah and Ethan, and moved toward the smoldering remains of last night's fire. The first shot cracked through the silence like thunder. Jacob spun toward the sound as William Fletcher stumbled from his wagon, clutching his chest. The second shot dropped him where he stood, and then chaos erupted. Men on horseback emerged from the mist, rifles and revolvers blazing. Jacob lunged for his weapon, but a burning pain erupted in his shoulder before his fingers could close around the stock. He fell against the wagon wheel as Sarah screamed inside. "Ethan, hide!" Jacob gasped, struggling to rise as blood soaked his shirt. Inside the wagon, Sarah frantically wrapped Ethan in a heavy canvas tarp. "Don't move, no matter what you hear," she whispered urgently, her eyes wild with terror. "Be still as death itself." She shoved the boy beneath the wagon's bench seating just as the canvas flap ripped open. Ethan watched through a tiny opening in the tarp as his mother fought, as the knife flashed, as her blood spattered across the canvas that concealed him. Her dying scream burned into his memory like a brand. The massacre was swift and methodical. The bandits, 7 men wearing mismatched clothing and cold expressions, killed without hesitation, without mercy. They weren't just robbers, they were predators who didn't want witnesses. After ensuring every adult and visible child had been slaughtered, they ransacked the wagons for valuables, food, and ammunition. Beneath the canvas, pressed against his mother's cooling body, Ethan remained perfectly still. The tarp that had been hastily thrown over him was now stained with his mother's blood, the metallic smell filling his nostrils as tears silently tracked down his face. Every instinct screamed for him to run, to cry out, but his mother's final command anchored him in place. Be still as death itself. The bandits spent hours methodically looting the wagons. Ethan heard them discussing which supplies to take, complaining about the quality of the whiskey they'd found, laughing about how easy the ambush had been. One suggested burning the wagons to eliminate evidence, but another argued it would create smoke that might attract attention. Leave it, a gruff voice finally decided. The mountains have plenty of scavengers. Won't be anything left in a week anyhow. As the sun climbed higher, the voices and hoofbeats finally receded. Still, Ethan didn't move. Hours passed. The inside of the wagon grew hot, the smell of death increasingly overpowering, but fear kept him frozen in place. Dusk brought new sounds, the scrabbling of smaller scavengers drawn by the scent of blood. Something climbed into the wagon, its claws scraping against wood. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, certain he was about to be discovered. Devoured. The canvas covering him shifted as something sniffed at it. Then came a sound unlike any he'd heard before. Not quite a growl, not quite a whine. The tarp was suddenly pulled aside, and Ethan found himself staring into the amber eyes of a large grey wolf. The wolf's muzzle wrinkled, exposing teeth designed for tearing flesh, but it didn't attack. Instead, it sniffed the boy thoroughly, perhaps confused by the mixture of living scent beneath the masking smell of death. Ethan remained perfectly still, employing the same strategy that had saved him from the human predators hours earlier. To his astonishment, the wolf didn't harm him. After its inspection, it turned and jumped down from the wagon. Ethan heard it moving around the campsite, occasionally growling at smaller scavengers that had already begun to feed on the bodies outside. Night fell completely, bringing with it mountain cold that penetrated the wagon's canvas. Thirst and hunger finally drove Ethan to move. Carefully, he extracted himself from beneath his mother's body, whispering an apology she couldn't hear. He found a water skin that had been overlooked by the bandits and drank deeply. Outside, the moonlight revealed the full horror of the massacre. Bodies lay where they had fallen. The Fletcher children sprawled near the extinguished campfire. His father crumpled against the wagon wheel. Ethan's young mind couldn't fully process the carnage. Instead, it retreated into a detached state where these broken forms no longer connected to the people he had known. Movement caught his eye. The grey wolf stood at the edge of the clearing, watching him. Beside it were 2 smaller wolves, not quite pups, but not fully grown. The adult wolf made that same sound again, the whine growl that seemed almost like communication, driven by a child's instinct for safety in the presence of adults, even non-human ones. Ethan found himself walking toward the wolves. The larger wolf didn't retreat. Instead, it watched his approach with those intelligent amber eyes, head slightly tilted, as if puzzled by this small human's behavior. When Ethan was just a few feet away, the wolf turned and trotted into the forest. After a moment's hesitation, the boy followed. What awaited him in the woods couldn't be worse than what lay behind. The wolves led him through the darkness with uncanny awareness of his human limitations. When the terrain became too difficult, they waited. When he stumbled, they paused. By dawn, they had traveled several miles from the massacre site, ascending higher into the mountains until they reached a rocky outcropping. Beneath it, a small cave entrance was partially hidden by scrub brush. The wolf entered first, followed by the younger ones. Exhaustion overwhelming his fear, Ethan crawled after them. Inside, the cave opened into a larger space, where 3 wolf pups tumbled and played. The adult, clearly the mother, settled on a bed of dried grass and leaves, watching as Ethan collapsed from fatigue just inside the entrance. When he woke hours later, hunger cramping his stomach, one of the older juvenile wolves was dropping a dead rabbit near his feet. It retreated immediately, watching from a distance as Ethan examined the offering. Understanding dawned slowly. This was food, but the concept of raw meat was foreign to him. His hesitation was interrupted when the mother wolf approached, took the rabbit, and tore it open with practiced efficiency. She consumed some, then stepped back, her behavior unmistakably demonstrating what was expected. Survival instinct overcame cultural conditioning. Ethan ate. Days passed, then weeks. The trauma of the massacre created a psychological barrier between Ethan and his human past. He stopped trying to speak. Words became unnecessary. The wolves communicated through posture, sound, and scent, a language far more primal but no less complex than human speech. Gradually, he began to understand it. The mother wolf, whom he came to recognize as the alpha of this small pack, seemed to have adopted him for reasons known only to her. Perhaps she sensed his vulnerability, his status as an orphan, not unlike strays her pack might take in. Or perhaps some deeper connection had formed in that first moment when prey didn't behave like prey, when the blood-covered boy had remained motionless beneath her scrutiny. Whatever the reason, she taught him as she taught her own young. How to move silently through the forest, how to use scent and sound to track prey, how to distinguish threatening humans whose scent carried metal and smoke from the occasional lone hunters who posed less danger. When autumn came, bringing colder nights, Ethan's human clothing had deteriorated to rags. The wolf taught him a different adaptation, how to dig out a shelter against the cold, how to curl together with the pack for warmth. His human need for fire remained unaddressed. Instead, he grew a thicker layer of dirt and adapted to the cold, as best his human physiology allowed. By winter, Ethan Miller had vanished. In his place was a feral child who moved on all fours more often than upright, who communicated through wolf-like vocalizations, who ate what the pack ate and slept where the pack slept. His past existed only in occasional nightmares that caused him to whimper in his sleep, prompting the mother wolf to move closer, her presence a comfort against horrors she couldn't understand. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Spring brought new lessons. The wolf pups from the previous year were now young adults, learning to hunt larger game. Ethan learned alongside them, his human limitations offset by his problem-solving abilities. He couldn't match their speed or strength, but he could anticipate prey movements and could flush animals toward waiting pack members. One crisp morning, as new green softened the mountainside, the pack tracked a wounded deer through a dense thicket. The animal's blood trail was easy to follow, even for Ethan's less sensitive nose. The mother wolf led them along the scent path, moving with purpose rather than stealth. The prey was too injured to flee quickly. None of them anticipated the other predator tracking the same wounded animal. As they broke into a small clearing, Ethan's wolf teachers suddenly froze, then began backing away, hackles raised. A mountain lion crouched over the deer carcass, its growl unmistakable even to human ears. The mother wolf positioned herself between the threat and her pack, including Ethan. The mountain lion assessed its odds against multiple opponents and seemed ready to abandon its kill when a sudden gust of wind carried a scent that caught its attention. Human scent, coming from the strange four-legged creature. Partially hidden behind the wolves, the mountain lion's instincts shifted. Humans meant danger, but also opportunity. Unlike the wolves who now saw Ethan as a pack, the mountain lion recognized him as separate, vulnerable. It charged, not toward the wolves, but directly at the boy. The mother wolf intercepted with savage precision, teeth finding the larger predator's throat even as claws raked her flank. The younger wolves joined the attack, darting in to bite at legs and hindquarters before retreating from slashing paws. Ethan, operating on pack instinct rather than human intelligence, did the same, darting forward to bite at the mountain lion's tail before scrambling back. The fight was brief but brutal. The mountain lion, realizing it was outnumbered and injured, finally broke away and fled into the forest. The wolves didn't pursue. Victory had come at a cost. The mother wolf's flank bore deep gashes that matted her grey fur with blood. That night, as the pack sheltered in their cave, Ethan stayed close to his wounded adoptive mother. She cleaned her injuries as best she could, but by morning her breathing was labored, her movements stiff. Infection had set in. For 3 days, the wolf grew weaker while Ethan and the younger wolves brought food she couldn't eat and water she barely lapped at. On the 4th morning, she didn't rise from her bed of leaves. By sunset, her breathing had stopped entirely. Ethan curled against her cooling body that night, making keening sounds that weren't quite human sobs, but carried the same grief. The pack dynamic had been shattered. Without the alpha, the younger wolves grew restless, uncertain. By the week's end, they had begun to drift away individually or in pairs, their instinct to find or form new packs overriding what tenuous connections remained. Only Ethan stayed, guarding the cave entrance for days after the last wolf departed. But hunger eventually drove him out, forcing him to attempt hunting alone for the first time. His success was limited. Small rodents, the occasional bird, whatever he could catch with his diminished human capabilities. As the season progressed, Ethan adapted again. He ranged farther from the cave, developed his own hunting techniques that relied more on patience and rudimentary tools than speed or strength. He became more solitary, more territorial, a pack of one, defending the memory of what he had lost. It was in this state, wilder than the wolves who had raised him, that Thomas Reed would find him the following autumn, a feral child crouched on a rocky ledge, studying the hunter with eyes that held both animal wariness and the buried ember of human recognition. Thomas Reed had been tracking the mountain lion for 3 days. The big cat had killed 2 of Jenkins' sheep and a calf belonging to the Harriston family, and the small settlement of Pine Ridge couldn't afford to lose more livestock. As the most experienced hunter in the area, Thomas had been tasked with eliminating the threat. The trail had led him higher into the mountains than he'd expected, into terrain few settlers ventured. Thomas was 43, with weathered skin that spoke of a life spent outdoors and eyes that missed little. He'd been among the first to settle in this valley 5 years earlier, after the Mexican-American War had opened new territories. Unlike many who came west seeking gold or land, Thomas sought solitude. The mountains provided that, along with game and fur that he could trade in town for necessities. The morning had started with promise, fresh tracks, a tuft of tawny fur caught on a thorn bush, signs that his quarry was slowing down. But by midday the trail had grown confusing. The mountain lion's prints occasionally overlapped with what appeared to be wolf tracks, though wolves had become scarce in these parts due to bounty hunters. As the sun began its westward descent, Thomas paused at a small stream to refill his canteen. A movement on the ridge above caught his attention. Too quick to be a deer, too low to the ground for a man. He reached for his rifle, scanning the rocky outcropping with narrowed eyes. There, a flash of movement again. Thomas raised his rifle, sighting along the barrel, then slowly lowered it in confusion. What he'd glimpsed wasn't the mountain lion, nor was it a wolf. It appeared to be a child, moving on all fours with an animal's gait. "Hello up there," Thomas called, Keeping his voice steady and non-threatening, the figure froze, then disappeared behind the rocks. Curiosity overwhelmed caution. Thomas secured his canteen and began climbing toward the ridge, moving slowly to avoid appearing aggressive. As he neared the spot where he'd seen the figure, he noticed a small cave entrance, partially hidden by brush. "Anyone there?" he called again, softer this time. "I won't hurt you." A low growl emerged from the cave, not animal, but not quite human either. Thomas had encountered a wide range of creatures in his years as a hunter and trapper, but this sound raised the hair on the back of his neck. Keeping a safe distance, he removed his pack and retrieved a strip of dried venison. He placed it on a flat rock midway between himself and the cave entrance, then retreated several yards, sitting down to appear less threatening. "Got some food here if you're hungry," he said conversationally, as if addressing a shy child. "Good. Venison. Smoked it myself last month." Minutes passed with no response. Thomas waited patiently, a skill honed through countless hunts. Eventually, patience was rewarded as a small head emerged from the cave entrance, sniffing the air cautiously. What Thomas saw nearly caused him to cry out in shock. A boy, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, though it was difficult to tell beneath the matted hair and dirt, crept from the cave on all fours. His movements were fluid and animal-like, nothing in them suggesting human socialization. Filthy. Rags that might once have been clothing hung from his thin frame. His hair was a tangled mass that fell past his shoulders, and his eyes, the most unsettling feature, held the wary calculation of a wild predator. The boy approached the meat with a series of stops and starts, freezing at Thomas's slightest movement. When he finally reached the venison, he snatched it with surprising speed and retreated several yards before tearing into it with his teeth, never taking his eyes off the hunter. Thomas fought to keep his expression neutral despite his shock. He'd heard stories, of course, tales told around campfires about children raised by wolves or bears, wild children found in forests across the frontier. He'd dismissed them as frontier myths. Now, the evidence crouched before him, tearing at dried meat with yellow teeth that had clearly never seen a toothbrush. "Where'd you come from, boy?" Thomas asked softly. The child showed no reaction to the words, continuing to eat while maintaining his vigilant stare. "Do you understand me?" Thomas tried again. "Do you have a name?" Still no response that indicated comprehension. As the boy finished the meat, Thomas slowly reached into his pack again, producing his water skin. He took a drink first, then placed it on the rock where the meat had been. This time, the boy approached. More quickly, his initial fear somewhat abated. He sniffed at the water skin, then awkwardly lifted it, spilling some before figuring out how to drink from it. Thomas noted that despite his animal-like behavior, the boy possessed the problem-solving ability to manipulate the unfamiliar object, a decidedly human trait. As evening approached, Thomas faced a dilemma. He couldn't leave the child here. Winter would come early to these mountains, and the boy's emaciated frame suggested he was already struggling to feed himself. Yet attempting to force the wild child to accompany him would likely result in the boy fleeing, perhaps never to be found. "Again, I'm going to make a small fire," Thomas announced, keeping his voice calm and even. "You can come closer if you'd like. It'll be warm." The boy retreated to the cave entrance as Thomas gathered kindling and struck his flint. When the flames caught, Thomas saw the boy's expression change for the first time. Fear mixed with fascination. Fire was clearly something he recognized, but didn't fully understand. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, Thomas sat quietly by his small fire, occasionally adding wood to maintain the flames. He deliberately placed his remaining food, another strip of venison and a small pouch of dried berries, within the circle of firelight, but distant enough from himself that the boy might approach. Stars were scattered across the night sky when the child finally edged toward the fire, His movement suggested internal conflict, drawn to the warmth but wary of the man. He settled at the furthest possible point from Thomas, while still benefiting from the fire's heat, curling into a tight ball with his eyes still fixed on the hunter. "Must have been out here a long time," Thomas mused aloud, not expecting a response, but hoping the sound of a human voice might stir something in the boy's memory. "Wonder where you came from. Someone must be missing you." The child showed no reaction to the words themselves, but the gentle cadence seemed to have a calming effect. His vigilance didn't waver, but his posture relaxed slightly. Thomas continued speaking softly, sharing inconsequential stories about his hunting cabin, the town in the valley, the changing seasons. He didn't approach the boy or make sudden movements. Instead, he created an atmosphere of safety through consistency and calm. When Thomas finally lay down to sleep, positioning himself so the fire remained between them, the boy stayed where he was, apparently unwilling to retreat to his cave, while the unfamiliar human remained nearby. Dawn broke with a clarity peculiar to high elevations. Thomas woke to find the boy still present, curled in an impossibly tight ball, seemingly asleep yet stirring at Thomas's first movement. The hunter deliberately moved slowly as he rekindled the fire and prepared a simple breakfast of journey cake. Cornmeal, mixed with water and cooked on a flat stone at the fire's edge. "Breakfast," he announced, breaking the journey cake in half and placing the larger portion on a flat rock near the boy. The child approached cautiously, sniffing the unfamiliar food before taking a small nibble. His reaction was immediate. Eyes widening at the taste of cooked food, something he had clearly been without for a very long time. He devoured the journey cake in seconds, then looked expectantly at Thomas's portion. Thomas smiled and broke his piece in half again, offering another section to the boy. "Need to fatten you up a bit," he said, noting how the child's ribs were visible through gaps in his ragged clothing. "Can't have you starving up here when winter comes." After breakfast, Thomas began packing his few supplies, moving deliberately, so as not to startle the boy. "I need to head back down the mountain," he explained, knowing the words themselves weren't understood, but hoping his tone conveyed his meaning. "You should come with me. There's more food where I live. Shelter, too." The boy watched him with that unnerving intensity, head slightly tilted, as if trying to decipher this strange creature's behavior. Thomas shouldered his pack and rifle, then pulled out his last strip of venison. He took a few steps down the trail, then turned and held out the meat. "Come on, boy, come with me." The child remained motionless by the dying fire. Thomas sighed, placed the venison on a rock, and took several more steps down the trail. The boy still didn't follow, but neither did he retreat to his cave. Thomas continued this pattern, walking a short distance, pausing to offer food or gentle encouragement, then proceeding for nearly an hour. Progress was painfully slow, but eventually the boy began trailing him at a distance, darting from cover to cover like a nervous deer. By midday, they had descended from the rocky ridge into thicker forest. The boy seemed increasingly anxious. In the denser vegetation, perhaps because it limited his ability to track Thomas's movements. Twice he disappeared entirely, and Thomas feared he had lost him, only to spot the child reappearing on a parallel path, keeping the hunter in sight. While maintaining his distance, late afternoon brought them to a small clearing where a crude log cabin stood beside a swift-flowing creek. Thomas's home was simple but sturdy. A single room with a stone fireplace, shelves stocked with preserved food, and animal hides covering the packed earth floor. A lean-to at the side housed firewood and tools. The boy hung back at the forest's edge, clearly alarmed by the unfamiliar structure. Thomas made no attempt to coax him closer. Instead, he busied himself starting a fire in the outdoor fire pit he used for cooking during warmer months. Once flames were crackling, he retrieved a rabbit from where it hung in his meat cache and began preparing it. aware of the boy's gaze following his every movement. The smell of cooking meat eventually accomplished what coaxing could not. As dusk settled over the clearing, the boy crept closer to the fire, nostrils flaring at the aroma. Thomas deliberately focused on his cooking, pretending not to notice the child's approach until he had settled just beyond the fire's immediate circle. Almost. "Ready?" Thomas commented, turning the spit where the rabbit cooked. "Best rabbit stew in the territory." When the meat was done, Thomas filled 2 wooden bowls, one for himself and a smaller one that he placed on a stump several feet from where he sat. The boy waited until Thomas began eating before approaching the second bowl. He sniffed it thoroughly, then abandoned any pretense of wariness and devoured the meat with single-minded focus. That night, Thomas slept in his cabin while the boy retreated to the forest edge. When dawn came, Thomas half expected the child to have vanished, returned to his mountain cave and wild existence. Instead, he found the boy curled beneath the lean-to, seeking shelter without committing to the confines of the cabin. "Good morning." Thomas greeted him, keeping his voice soft. "Thought we might have some washing up today." The boy's feral appearance was more apparent in the clear morning light. Layers of dirt covered his skin, and his hair was matted into clumps that resembled dreadlocks. The rags hanging from his frame might have once been a child's clothing, but now barely preserved his modesty. His feet were calloused and tough, suggesting years without shoes. Thomas heated water and placed a large wooden tub in the yard, adding enough cold water to make the temperature bearable. He mimed washing his own arms and face, then gestured to the boy and the tub. The child's reaction to the tub was unexpected. Rather than fear or confusion, he showed recognition. A flicker of memory, perhaps, of baths from his life before the wilderness. He approached the water cautiously, dipping, one hand in and bringing it to his nose. After a moment's consideration, he stepped into the tub fully clothed, sitting down in the water with an expression of surprise that might have been his first human emotion beyond fear or hunger. Thomas handed him a small piece of rough soap, demonstrating on his own hands how to create lather. The boy copied the motion awkwardly, then began rubbing the soap directly on his arms, watching in fascination as the dirt gave way to reveal surprisingly pale skin beneath. The process of cleaning the wild child took most of the morning. Thomas gently helped wash his hair, untangling what could be saved and cutting away the worst mats. The rags that had served as clothing were beyond salvation and were replaced with a simple shirt that hung to the boy's knees, the smallest garment Thomas possessed. Clearly intended for an adult, but better than nothing. Clean and dressed in the oversized shirt, the boy looked more human, but no less wild. His posture remained animal-like, his movements those of a creature accustomed to 4 limbs rather than 2. Most tellingly, his eyes retained that feral watchfulness, constantly tracking Thomas's movements with an alertness born of survival necessity. Over the following days, a routine developed. The boy slept beneath the lean-to, accepting food from Thomas, but retreating if the hunter moved too quickly or came too close. He showed no comprehension of language, but began responding to tones and gestures. He particularly seemed to respond to Thomas's singing, rough frontier ballads and hymns that the hunter sometimes sang while working. During these moments, the boy would grow still, head tilted in that curious way, as if straining to capture a distant memory. 2 weeks after, bringing the child down from the mountain, Thomas decided it was time to seek help. The boy needed more than he alone could provide: medical attention, proper clothing, perhaps family who had been searching for their lost child. The nearest settlement, Pine Ridge, was a half-day's journey by foot. "We're going to town tomorrow," Thomas informed the boy as they sat by the evening fire. "Other people there. They can help us figure out where you came from." The child gave no indication of understanding, but accepted the piece of cornbread Thomas offered him. His table manners had improved marginally. He now used his fingers rather than simply tearing at food with his teeth, and he had learned to wait until food was offered rather than snatching it. Morning brought clear skies and mild temperatures, ideal for the journey. Thomas packed lightly, including extra food and a blanket for the boy. The child seemed to sense something different in Thomas's preparations, growing increasingly agitated as the hunter readied himself for travel. "It's all right," Thomas assured him. "We're just going to meet some folks who can help you." When Thomas started down the trail that led toward Pine Ridge, the boy didn't immediately follow. He stood at the edge of the clearing, shifting his weight, anxiously from foot to foot, caught between the security of the familiar cabin area and his apparent trust in the hunter. "Come on, boy," Thomas called, his voice gentle but firm. "Time to go." After a moment's hesitation, the child followed, moving with the same cautious distance he had maintained during their first journey down from the mountain. Thomas kept a deliberate pace, allowing the boy to become comfortable with their travel. By mid-morning, the child had drawn somewhat closer, occasionally venturing near enough that Thomas could have reached out and touched him. Though he was careful not to try, the first sign of civilization appeared shortly after noon, a split-rail fence marking the boundary of the Jenkins farm. The boy froze at the sight, his posture instantly reverting to a more animal-like crouch. "It's all right," Thomas soothed. "Just a fence, nothing to worry about." But the child was clearly distressed by this evidence of human habitation. As they continued and more farms became visible in the distance, his agitation grew. He began making small, distressed sounds, the first vocalizations Thomas had heard from him beyond growls. By the time the settlement itself came into view, a collection of perhaps 30 buildings clustered around a main street, the boy was trembling visibly. He stopped completely at the edge of the tree line, refusing to step into the open area that led to the town. Thomas knelt to bring himself closer to the child's level. "I know this is frightening," he said softly, "but there are good people here who can help you, maybe even find your family." At the word family, something flickered in the boy's eyes, not recognition precisely, but a deeper distress. He backed away another step, shaking his head violently in the first clear communication. "A refusal. All right," Thomas conceded. "You wait here in the trees. I'll go talk to some folks, see what they think we should do. Won't be gone long." He pointed to a large oak at the forest edge. "You stay by that tree. I'll come back to that spot, understand?" The boy's gaze followed Thomas's pointing finger to the oak, then back to the hunter's face. After a moment, he gave a single sharp nod, a surprisingly human gesture that suggested more comprehension than he had previously demonstrated. "Good boy," Thomas said, relieved. "I'll be back soon." As he turned toward town, Thomas heard a soft sound behind him. Looking back, he saw the boy had backed further into the forest shadows, but remained watching, one hand resting against the oak tree's trunk, acknowledging their arrangement. Pine Ridge was typical of frontier settlements: a general store, a blacksmith, a small church, and various houses and workshops clustered together for protection and convenience. Thomas's arrival drew curious looks, as his visits to town were infrequent and usually motivated by trading furs or purchasing supplies. His first stop was the sheriff's office, a small building adjacent to the general store. Sheriff Daniel Blackwood was a former Army officer who had settled in Pine Ridge after the war with Mexico. He was fair-minded and practical, qualities Thomas respected. "Reed," the sheriff greeted him, looking up from paperwork. "Didn't expect to see you before the first snow. What brings you down from your mountain?" "Found something unusual up there, Daniel," Thomas replied, settling into the chair across from the sheriff's desk. "Actually, someone. A boy, living wild. Been watching him for 3 days now, trying to figure out what to do." The sheriff's eyebrows rose. "A child? Alone in the mountains?" Thomas nodded. "Feral as any wolf I've ever seen. Doesn't speak, Moves on all fours half the time. Been up there for years from the look of him. He's maybe 12 or 13 now. Hard to tell exactly. Good Lord, Blackwood murmured. Where is he now? Edge of town. Wouldn't come closer. Too frightened of the buildings, I reckon. He's waiting by the big oak at the North Trail. The sheriff leaned back, considering. Any idea where he came from? Any identifying marks or clothing? Thomas shook his head. Rags when I found him, nothing recognizable. No scars or marks I could see, though he was filthy. Cleaned him up some. At my cabin. Could be from one of the massacred wagon trains, Blackwood mused. We've had 3 hit in the high passes in the last decade. Bandits or Indians, never figured out which. That's what I was thinking, Thomas agreed. If he somehow survived and was raised by wolves, the sheriff finished skeptically. Sounds like a tall tale, I know. But you should see him, Daniel. The way he moves, the sounds he makes, he wasn't raised by people, that's certain. The sheriff drummed his fingers on his desk thoughtfully. Well, we should get Doc Simmons to look at him, and maybe Reverend Hayes would know if any of the church folks back east have reports of missing children. The boy won't come into town, Thomas reminded him, and I don't think forcing him would end well. He spooks easily. Then we'll go to him, the sheriff decided, standing. Let me fetch the doctor. Meet us at the Oak in 15 minutes. Thomas spent the waiting time at the general store, purchasing supplies for himself and items he thought might help the boy. Proper clothing, a small knife suitable for a child, and a comb for the tangled hair that remained even after his efforts. To clean the boy up, when he returned to the oak tree, Thomas was relieved to find the boy still there, though he had retreated higher into the branches at the approach of the hunter and his companions. Sheriff Blackwood and Doc Simmons stood at a respectful distance, observing the wild child with expressions of fascination and concern. My God, the doctor murmured. I thought you might be exaggerating, Reed. If anything, I understated it, Thomas replied quietly. He's been with me 2 weeks now, and this is the most human interaction he's shown. He looked up at the boy perched in the tree. It's all right. These men are friends. They won't hurt you. The boy made no move to descend, but watched them intently, his gaze shifting between the 3 men with obvious wariness. He doesn't understand English, Thomas explained, or if he does, he gives no sign of it, but he responds to tone and gestures. How have you been communicating with him? The sheriff asked. Mostly I talk, he watches. He's learned to wait for food rather than grabbing it. Figured out the outhouse on his own after watching me. Smart boy, just... Thomas trailed off, searching. And for the right word. Feral, Doc Simmons supplied, raised without human socialization during critical developmental years. The doctor was younger than most frontier physicians, educated at a proper medical school in Philadelphia before seeking adventure in the Western Territories. There are documented cases in Europe, children found living with wolves or bears, unable to speak or behave as humans. Can he be helped? The sheriff asked. Possibly. The younger they're found, the better their chances of reintegration. I'd need to examine him properly to assess his condition. Thomas looked up at the boy again. Hear that? The doctor wants to make sure you're healthy. Will you come down and let him look at you? The child's only response was to edge further out on his branch, away from the men. I have an idea, Thomas said after a moment. He reached into his pack and pulled out the small knife he had purchased at the general store. Keeping his movements slow and deliberate, he unwrapped the simple blade with its wooden handle. Look here, boy. Got something for you. The child's attention sharpened at the sight of the knife. Tools, it seemed, held meaning for him, despite his years in the wild. Thomas placed the knife on a flat rock beneath the tree, then backed away several paces. It's yours, a gift. After a long moment of internal debate visible in his shifting posture, the boy descended from the tree with surprising agility. He approached the rock cautiously, never taking his eyes off the 3 men, and quickly snatched the knife. Rather than retreat immediately, however, he examined the blade with obvious appreciation, testing its edge against his thumb. "He understands tools," Doc Simmons noted quietly. "That suggests he retains memories from before his time in the wild. How old would you estimate he was when whatever happened, Thomas considered. "Based on the rags he was wearing, I'd guess 5 or 6. Old enough to have some language and human behavior, but young enough to adapt to living wild." While they spoke, the boy had retreated to the base of the oak, knife clutched in one hand. He was watching them with slightly less fear now, the gift. Having established a tentative trust, "I think it's best if the boy stays with Thomas for now," Sheriff Blackwood decided. "He's clearly formed some bonds there. Doc, can you come out to Reed's cabin tomorrow to examine him properly? And I'll send inquiries about missing children to the territorial offices. Maybe someone's been searching for him all these years." As the men discussed arrangements, none of them noticed the boy's increasing attention to their conversation, or more specifically, to certain words. When the sheriff mentioned missing children, the boy's expression changed subtly, a shadow passing across his features. By the time they concluded their discussion, the sun was beginning to set. Thomas bid farewell to the sheriff and doctor, promising to expect them the following day. As he turned back toward the trail that would lead them to his cabin, he found the boy already waiting, clutching his new knife and watching Thomas with an intensity that suggested he had understood more of the conversation than anyone suspected. "Ready to head home?" Thomas asked. The boy nodded once, a deliberate human gesture that took Thomas by surprise. As they began the journey back to the cabin, the hunter noticed the child walking more upright than before, his movements slightly less animal-like. Something had awakened in the wild boy, something that Thomas couldn't fully identify, but that suggested the human child wasn't as thoroughly buried beneath the wolf-taught survivor as he had initially thought. Whether that awakening would lead to healing or greater trauma remained to be seen. But Thomas Reed was determined to help the boy navigate whatever memories were beginning to surface after years hidden in the wilderness of his mind. The journey back to Thomas's cabin passed in contemplative silence. The wild boy walked closer to Thomas than he had previously, occasionally glancing at the hunter with an expression that suggested internal struggle. Thomas noticed these changes, but made no comment, allowing the child to process whatever awakening was occurring within him at his own pace. Night had fallen by the time they reached the clearing. Thomas built up the fire while the boy retreated to his usual spot beneath the lean-to, clutching his new knife. After preparing a simple meal of cornbread and beans, Thomas filled 2 wooden bowls and placed one near the lean-to as had become their custom. "Quite a day," Thomas commented as they ate. "Sheriff and the doctor seem like good men. They want to help you." The boy paused in his eating, studying Thomas with that penetrating gaze that always made the hunter feel as if the child could see more than he let on. After a moment, the boy made a sound, not his usual animal-like growl, but something closer to a human vocalization. It wasn't quite a word, but it suggested an attempt at speech. Thomas kept his excitement carefully contained. "That's right," he encouraged gently. "You can talk if you want to, no rush though." The remainder of the evening passed uneventfully, with Thomas tending to chores around the cabin while the boy watched from a distance. When Thomas finally retired to his bed inside the cabin, he left the door slightly ajar, an invitation he had extended each night since bringing the child home, but which had never been accepted. Some time later, Thomas woke to the sound of movement near his bed. Opening his eyes slowly, he found the wild boy standing just inside the cabin door, silhouetted against the moonlight filtering through the opening. The child was perfectly still, watching Thomas with an intensity that might have been frightening, if the hunter hadn't come to understand it as the boy's way of processing unfamiliar situations. "Couldn't sleep?" Thomas asked softly, remaining motionless to avoid startling the boy. The child made no response but continued his silent observation. After several minutes, he abruptly turned and slipped back outside. Thomas heard him settling. Beneath the lean-to, the familiar rustling suggesting he was arranging his blanket. It was a small step, entering the cabin voluntarily, if only briefly, but it represented significant progress in the boy's comfort with human habitation. Thomas fell back asleep, feeling cautiously optimistic about the child's gradual return to humanity. Dawn brought clear skies and the promise of visitors. Thomas rose early to prepare the cabin and its surroundings, wanting to make the coming examination as non-threatening as possible for the boy. He constructed a simple bench near the outdoor fire pit, thinking the child might be more comfortable being examined in the open air rather than inside the confined space of the cabin. The boy watched these preparations with evident wariness, his body language growing increasingly tense as the morning progressed. By the time hoofbeats announced the approach of riders, he had retreated to the edge of the clearing, poised, as if ready to flee into the forest at the slightest provocation. "It's all right," Thomas called to him. "Just the doctor and sheriff." Like yesterday, remember? Sheriff Blackwood arrived first, followed by Doc Simmons and, unexpectedly, a third rider, a slender woman with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. Thomas recognized her as widow Abigail Porter, who ran the small schoolhouse in Pine Ridge. Her presence was surprising. The widow rarely left town, dedicating herself entirely to the education of the settlement's children. "Ms. Porter insisted on joining us," the sheriff explained as they dismounted. "She has experience with troubled children." The widow's stern countenance softened as she caught sight of the wild boy at the forest's edge. "The poor child," she murmured. "Sheriff Blackwood told me of his condition, but seeing is quite different from hearing." Thomas turned to where the boy crouched, noting how the child's attention had fixed on Abigail Porter with particular intensity. "That's Ms. Porter," he explained to the boy. "She teaches children in town." The boy made no move to approach, but neither did he retreat further into the forest, a hopeful sign that Thomas interpreted as growing trust. "Perhaps we should allow him to become accustomed to our presence before attempting any examination," Doc Simmons suggested. "Rushing the process may undo the progress Mr. Reed has made in gaining his confidence." They settled around the outdoor fire pit, accepting the coffee Thomas brewed. The boy remained at the forest's edge, observing this social ritual with evident curiosity. Widow Porter occasionally glanced in his direction, but made no overt attempts to engage him, seeming to understand instinctively that patience would be necessary. "I've sent inquiries about missing children to the territorial offices in Sacramento," Sheriff Blackwood informed Thomas, "but I'm not optimistic about quick responses. Records from the early settlement period are spotty at best, and many wagon train massacres went undocumented except by those who discovered the aftermath." "The child would have been very young when it happened," Doc Simmons added. 5 or 6, based on his current estimated age and the likely time he spent in the wild. Even if we locate records of a missing boy from that period, confirming his identity will be challenging without family to recognize him. Throughout this conversation, Thomas noticed the boy gradually edging closer to their circle, drawn by curiosity or perhaps by the casual, non-threatening atmosphere they had created. By the time they finished their coffee, he had moved to within 10 yards of the group, still maintaining a cautious distance, but clearly interested in their interaction. "Hello there," Widow Porter finally addressed him directly, her voice gentle but not condescending. "My name is Abigail. I've brought something that might interest you." She reached slowly into her satchel and withdrew a small leather-bound book. The boy tensed momentarily at her movement, but remained in place, watching as she opened the book to reveal colorful illustrations of animals. "This is a book about creatures of the wilderness," she explained, holding it so the boy could see the pictures from his position. "Bears, deer, wolves, creatures you might know." At the mention of wolves, the boy's demeanor changed subtly. He stretched his neck slightly, trying to see the illustration better without coming closer. Noting his interest, Widow Porter carefully placed the book on the ground midway between herself and the boy, then retreated to her original position. "You can look at it if you'd like," she offered. After a moment's hesitation, the boy approached the book in a series of cautious movements, never taking his eyes off the four adults. When he reached it, he crouched to examine the open page, which showed a detailed illustration of a grey wolf. His reaction was immediate and profound. A sound escaped him, not quite a word, but a vocalization that carried unmistakable emotion. His fingers traced the illustration with surprising gentleness. "He recognizes it," Thomas said quietly. "Wolves must have been part of his life in the wild." "More than just part of it, I'd wager," the sheriff replied. "The way he's responding, it's almost like seeing a picture of family." The comparison struck Thomas as surprisingly apt. During his years as a hunter and trapper, he had observed wolf in packs enough to understand their complex social structures. If the boy had somehow been accepted into such a pack during his formative years, the wolves would indeed have been his family in every meaningful sense. Widow Porter turned the pages slowly, allowing the boy to examine other illustrations: bears, mountain lions, deer, birds of prey. He showed interest in each, but none provoked the emotional response that the wolf had elicited. "I believe we might use this connection to help him," Doc Simmons suggested. "The wolves represent a bridge between his feral existence and human interaction. Miss Porter, would you be willing to work with the boy using such materials?" The widow nodded without hesitation. "Every child deserves education, regardless of their circumstances. If pictures of wolves help him connect with humans again, then wolves it shall be." While this discussion continued, the boy had settled cross-legged, on the ground with the book in his lap, seemingly forgetting his wariness in his fascination with the illustrations. This provided Doc Simmons the opportunity he had been waiting for, a chance to observe the child more closely without causing distress. The doctor moved slowly to sit near the boy, careful to maintain a non-threatening distance. "Hello there," he said softly. "I'm Dr. Simmons. I'd like to make sure you're healthy, if that's all right with you." The boy glanced up from the book, studying the doctor with that penetrating gaze. After a moment, he returned his attention to the illustrations, neither accepting nor rejecting the doctor's presence. Taking this as tacit permission, Doc Simmons began a careful visual examination, noting observations in a small notebook. "Physically, he appears remarkably healthy given his circumstances," he commented. "No obvious signs of malnutrition, though he's certainly lean. Good muscle tone, likely from constant movement in the wild. His skin shows numerous healed scratches and minor scars, but nothing that suggests serious injury." The doctor's clinical assessment continued, noting the boy's estimated age, 12 to 13, his physical development, appropriate for age though somewhat stunted, and his motor skills, excellent, particularly gross motor control. Throughout this process, the boy continued paging through the book, occasionally glancing at the doctor but showing no fear as long as no attempt was made to touch him. "I'd like to examine him more thoroughly," Doc Simmons explained to Thomas. "Check his heart, lungs, and reflexes, but that would require physical contact, which I'm hesitant to attempt without building more trust." Widow Porter closed her satchel, having observed the interaction closely. "Perhaps we should establish a routine," she suggested. "I could visit several times a week with books and simple learning materials. As he becomes accustomed to regular human presence beyond Mr. Reed, he might grow more comfortable with examination." The sheriff nodded in agreement. "That seems sensible. and it gives us time to receive responses to our inquiries about missing children. As their discussion continued, none of them immediately noticed that the boy had paused on a particular page in the book. When Thomas finally glanced in his direction, he found the child staring intently at an illustration that wasn't of an animal at all, but rather a frontier scene showing a wagon train crossing a mountain pass. The boy's entire demeanor had changed. His body was rigid, his knuckles white where they gripped the book's edges. Most striking was his expression, fear and recognition, intermingled in a way that suggested the image had triggered something significant. "Look," Thomas said quietly, drawing the other's attention to the boy's reaction. Doc Simmons observed carefully. "A memory response," he murmured. "The wagon train image has triggered something traumatic." With trembling fingers, the boy traced the illustrated wagons, then abruptly closed the book and thrust it away from himself. A sound escaped him, a whimper that was decidedly human in its expression of distress. Widow Porter moved carefully to retrieve the book, opening it to examine the page that had provoked such a reaction. "This suggests his history may indeed be connected to a wagon train," she noted. "Perhaps one that met with tragedy, as Sheriff Blackwood theorized." The boy had drawn his knees to his chest, rocking slightly in a self-soothing motion that seemed instinctive rather than learned. Thomas recognized the signs of distress and moved closer, speaking in the same gentle tone he had used since first encountering the child. "It's all right," he soothed. "You're safe here. No one will hurt you." To everyone's surprise, the boy responded, not by retreating, but by reaching out to grasp Thomas's sleeve, a gesture that sought comfort rather than distance. It was the first time he had initiated physical contact, and Thomas remained perfectly still, allowing the child to maintain this tenuous connection on his own terms. After a moment, the boy released his grip and returned to his self-contained posture. But something had shifted in his demeanor. A barrier had been crossed, if only briefly. "I believe we've done enough for today," Doc Simmons decided. "The boy has shown remarkable tolerance for our presence, but we shouldn't push further. I'll leave some basic medicines with you, Mr. Reed. Salves for any injuries he might sustain, tonics to supplement his nutrition." The sheriff nodded in agreement. "Miss Porter, would you be willing to return tomorrow with more books? Perhaps focusing on simpler subjects initially, avoiding potentially triggering images until we better understand his history." The widow agreed readily, her stern countenance softening as she regarded the wild child. "I'll bring primers, designed for young learners. Pictures with basic words might help stimulate any language memory he retains." As their visitors prepared to depart, Thomas noticed the boy watching the horses with particular attention. Unlike his earlier wariness, this seemed more like curiosity, perhaps another fragment of memory from his life before the wilderness. "Would you like to see the horses?" Thomas asked, gesturing toward the animals. After a moment's hesitation, the boy rose and followed Thomas to where the 3 horses were tethered. He approached cautiously, but without fear, reaching out to touch the sheriff's mount with gentle fingers. The horse nickered softly, apparently unbothered by the wild child's scent or behavior. "He's remembering," Thomas observed quietly to Doc Simmons, who had joined them. "Bit by bit, pieces of his human past are surfacing. It's a promising sign," the doctor agreed, "but we should be prepared for difficulties as more traumatic memories emerge. Whatever happened to separate him from humanity was clearly violent based on his reaction to the wagon train illustration." The visitors departed with promises to return the following day, leaving Thomas and the boy alone once more. The remainder of the day passed quietly, with the child seeming more subdued than usual, occasionally staring into the distance with an expression that suggested internal processing. That night, Thomas was awakened again by movement within the cabin. Opening his eyes, he found the boy standing beside his bed, closer than he had ventured previously. In the dim moonlight filtering through the cabin's single window, Thomas could see tears on the child's face, perhaps the first he had shed since being found. "What is it, boy?" Thomas asked softly, sitting up slowly. The child made a series of sounds, not quite words, but more deliberate than his usual vocalizations. His hands moved in gestures that seemed to be reaching for expression his voice couldn't. "Yet provide you're remembering something," Thomas guessed. "Something from before." The boy nodded, a distinctly human affirmation. Then, with evident effort, he produced a sound that froze Thomas's blood. "Ma, ma." The word was garbled, barely recognizable, but unmistakable in its meaning. After years of silence, the first human word the wild child had attempted to speak was a call for his mother. Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Your mama," he acknowledged gently. "You remember her?" The boy's face contorted with an expression of grief so raw it seemed to transcend his years in the wilderness. Whatever had happened to the child's mother, the memory of it was surfacing, now bringing with it pain that had perhaps been mercifully buried during his feral existence. Without thinking, Thomas opened his arms in the universal gesture of comfort. To his surprise, the boy moved into the embrace, his thin body shaking with silent sobs. Thomas held him gently, this child who had survived unimaginable circumstances, who had been human, then wolf, and was now struggling to become human again. "It's all right," Thomas murmured, though he knew it wasn't, might never entirely be. "You're safe now." The boy cried himself to sleep in Thomas's arms, the first time he had slept indoors since being found. When morning came, Thomas woke to find the child still beside him, curled into a tight ball reminiscent of how wolves sleep, yet seeking human proximity in a way he hadn't before. As sunlight filtered through the cabin window, the boy stirred and opened his eyes. For a moment, confusion clouded his features, the disorientation of waking in an unfamiliar setting. Then recognition dawned, and he regarded Thomas with an expression that had changed subtly overnight. There was more awareness in his gaze now, more human consciousness behind the feral wariness. "Good morning," Thomas greeted him softly. The boy didn't speak, but he nodded in response, another small but significant step toward human interaction. He sat up, examining the cabin's interior with new interest, as if seeing it properly for the first time. Thomas prepared a simple breakfast, noting how the boy watched his movements with focused attention, seemingly studying the process of food. Preparation rather than merely awaiting the result. When Thomas handed him a bowl, the child attempted to hold the spoon correctly, clumsily mimicking Thomas's grip and movements. "That's right," Thomas encouraged. "You'll get the hang of it again." After breakfast, Thomas stepped outside to check his traps and tend to morning chores. To his surprise, the boy followed, maintaining closer proximity than had been his custom. When Thomas began chopping wood, the child observed intently, then picked up a fallen twig and mimicked the chopping motion, a deliberate imitation that suggested a new desire to relearn human activities. As the morning progressed, Thomas noticed the boy occasionally touching his own throat and making soft sounds, as if practicing the physical mechanics of speech. The breakthrough of the previous night, that single word, mama, seemed to have awakened something dormant, a connection to language that had been buried beneath years of animal communication. By midday, when the sound of approaching horses signaled the return of their visitors, the boy showed none of his previous anxiety. Instead, he positioned himself near Thomas, watching the trail with what appeared to be anticipation rather than fear. Widow Porter arrived first, her satchel bulging with books. The sheriff followed shortly after, bringing news that territorial offices had begun searching records for reports of missing children from wagon trains massacred in the region years earlier. The widow settled on the bench Thomas had constructed, beckoning to the boy with a gentle smile. "I've brought more books today," she announced. "Would you like to see them?" To everyone's surprise, the boy approached directly, seating himself on the ground near her feet without the cautious circling that had characterized his previous interactions. Widow Porter opened a simple primer, pointing to illustrations of common objects paired with their written names. "This is a house," she explained, indicating the picture and the word beneath it. "And this is a tree. Can you point to a tree you can see from here?" After a moment's consideration, the boy extended his arm to indicate a tall pine at the clearing's edge. The widow smiled approvingly. "Very good. You understand." The session continued with similar simple exercises, the boy demonstrating clear comprehension of basic concepts while remaining nonverbal, apart from occasional sounds that suggested attempts at forming words. His progress was remarkable given his circumstances, confirming Doc Simmons' theory that he had possessed language before his time in the wilderness. Sheriff Blackwood observed these interactions with evident interest. "Amazing how quickly he's responding," he commented to Thomas. "Just yesterday he was hardly approaching humans, and now he's participating in lessons." "Something changed last night," Thomas explained, describing the breakthrough when the boy had spoken his first word and sought comfort. "It's as if a dam broke. Memories are returning, and with them, more human behavior." "We should proceed carefully," the sheriff cautioned. Doc Simmons warned that traumatic memories might surface alongside positive ones. If this child witnessed a massacre, as we suspect, those memories could be devastating. Thomas nodded solemnly. "I know. But we can't keep him from remembering forever. Better he faces it with support than alone." As they spoke, Widow Porter had progressed to a different book, one containing simple stories rather than just labeled illustrations. The boy listened with rapt attention as she read aloud, his eyes tracking her finger as it moved beneath the words. "He's following the text," the widow noted with quiet excitement. "I believe he may have begun learning to read before whatever happened to him." This observation sparked hope that more of the boy's early education might remain accessible, buried but not erased by his years living as a wild creature. It suggested possibilities for his rehabilitation that had seemed improbable just days earlier. The afternoon passed in alternating periods of lessons with Widow Porter and rest, when the boy's attention began to wander. By the time the visitors prepared to leave, the child had demonstrated remarkable progress, pointing correctly to objects when named, attempting to trace letters in the dirt with a stick, and most significantly, responding consistently to human interaction without retreating to his feral behaviors. As the widow mounted her horse, she smiled down at the boy who stood beside Thomas. "You've done very well today," she told him. "Tomorrow we'll try some writing." The boy nodded in acknowledgement, then unexpectedly raised his hand in a tentative wave as she turned her horse toward town. A distinctly human gesture of farewell that he must have remembered from his life before the wilderness. Thomas felt a swell of emotion watching this small act that represented such significant progress. The feral child was finding his way back to humanity, step by step, memory by memory. Yet Thomas couldn't shake a sense of foreboding about what complete remembrance might bring. What horrors lurked in the boy's past that his wolf existence had allowed him to forget? And what would happen when those memories fully surfaced? The answer would come sooner than any of them expected, and in a form none of them could have anticipated. A week passed with remarkable progress. Each day, Widow Porter arrived with books and simple learning materials, spending hours coaxing humanity back into the wild child's behavior. By the 5th day, the boy was sleeping inside the cabin on a pallet Thomas had constructed near the fireplace. He had begun using a spoon consistently, washing his hands before meals, and even attempting to brush his own hair with a comb Thomas provided. Language remained the greatest challenge. Though the boy clearly understood much of what was said to him, his own speech was limited to a handful of halting words: Mama, no, yes, and most recently, Thomas, which he pronounced with such effort that it sounded more like Tamu. Nevertheless, these fragments of speech represented extraordinary progress for a child who had lived without human language for approximately 7 years. On the 8th day since Thomas had brought the boy down from the mountain, Doc Simmons returned. With news, Sheriff Blackwood received a response from the territorial office in Sacramento, he explained, as Thomas poured him coffee. There's a record of a wagon train massacre from 1847, about 7 years ago. 4 families who broke away from a larger caravan to follow a supposed shortcut through the high passes. No survivors were officially documented, but the search party found evidence that at least one body was missing. Thomas glanced to where the boy sat near the cabin, sorting through colored stones Widow Porter had brought to teach him basic counting. You think it's him? The timing fits, Doc Simmons replied. The location is about 20 miles north of where you found him, not an impossible distance for a wolf pack to travel with a pup, even a human one. And one of the families had a son, approximately the right age. What was his name? Thomas asked quietly. The doctor consulted a folded paper from his pocket. According to the manifest, Jacob and Sarah Miller were traveling with their son Ethan, age 6 at the time of departure from Independence. Thomas tested the name silently, watching the boy who might once have answered it. Ethan Miller, he finally said aloud. The boy's head snapped up, his eyes widening as the sound of the name reached him. He dropped the stones he'd been sorting and stared at Thomas with an expression of such intense focus that it seemed he was trying to grasp something just beyond his mental reach. Ethan, Thomas repeated gently. Is that your name? Ethan Miller? The child's breathing quickened. He raised one hand to his throat, as he often did when struggling to produce speech. After several attempts, he managed a sound that might have been "eh" before frustration overtook him. He slammed his palm against the ground, an unusual display of anger from a child who had generally shown remarkable patience with his limitations. Doc Simmons observed with professional interest. The name clearly triggers something. Whether it's recognition or just a response to our focus, it's hard to determine. Thomas approached slowly, kneeling to the boy's eye level. It's all right, he soothed. No need to speak if it's too difficult. But I'm wondering if we should start calling you Ethan. Would that be all right? The boy, Ethan, studied Thomas's face intently, then gave a single deliberate nod. Ethan it is then, Thomas decided, offering a reassuring smile. It's good to properly meet you, Ethan Miller. Something in the child's expression shifted at the full name, a shadow passing behind his eyes that suggested a painful association with Miller. He accepted Ethan with a nod, but shook his head vigorously at Miller. Just Ethan for now, Thomas amended, noting this reaction. Doc Simmons made notes in his small, leather-bound journal. Fascinating. He accepts the given name, but rejects the family name. Perhaps the surname carries stronger associations with the traumatic event. The doctor spent the remainder of his visit conducting a more thorough physical examination than had previously been possible. Ethan now allowed careful touching, though he still flinched at sudden movements. Doc Simmons listened to his heart and lungs, tested reflexes, examined his teeth and ears, and carefully documented the numerous small scars that mapped the boy's journey through the wilderness. Physically, he's remarkably healthy given his circumstances, the doctor concluded. His teeth showed damage consistent with a carnivorous diet, some unusual wear patterns from tearing raw meat. There's evidence of healed fractures in 2 fingers and his left forearm, all of which knitted well despite lack of medical treatment. His hearing and vision appear exceptionally acute, which isn't surprising given his survival requirements. What? About his mind, Thomas asked, keeping his voice low, though Ethan had wandered to the edge of the clearing to watch a squirrel. Doc Simmons considered carefully. It's unprecedented, at least in my experience. Most documented cases of feral children, found after years in the wild, show permanent impairments. They never fully regain language or human social behavior, but Ethan, he glanced toward the boy, he's recovering at an extraordinary rate. It suggests he was not only older when he went into the wild, giving him a stronger foundation of human development, but that something about his experience preserved rather than destroyed his human capabilities. The wolves, Thomas suggested. From what I've observed as a hunter, wolf packs have complex social structures. They communicate, cooperate, and teach their young. It's not human society, but it's not solitary survival either. That could be significant, the doctor agreed. Rather than regressing to purely instinctual behavior, Ethan may have transferred his social development to the wolf pack context. Different rules and methods, but still a framework for interaction and relationship. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Widow Porter, who brought news of her own. The church congregation has been inquiring about the wild child, she informed them after dismounting. Reverend Hayes mentioned Ethan during Sunday service, and now everyone's curious. Some are calling it a miracle, a child surviving alone in the wilderness all these years. Thomas frowned slightly. He wasn't alone. He had the wolves. Yes, well, that's the part many find difficult to accept, the widow acknowledged with a tight smile. In any case, Reverend Hayes has asked if he might visit. I told him I would consult with you first, Mr. Reed. Thomas considered the request carefully. Thus far, they had limited Ethan's exposure to just 3 adults, himself, Doc Simmons, and Widow Porter. Introducing new people risked overwhelming the boy's fragile progress, yet isolation would not serve his reintegration into human society. Perhaps next week, Thomas decided, when Ethan's a bit more settled with his speech, and only the Reverend for now, not the entire congregation. The widow nodded in agreement before turning her attention to Ethan, who had returned from watching the squirrel and now stood at a slight distance, observing the adults' conversation. "Good morning, Ethan," she greeted him, using the name naturally as if she'd always called him that. "I've bought something special today." From her satchel, she produced a slate and chalk. "This is for writing. Would you like to learn?" Ethan approached with interest, examining the items as Widow Porter demonstrated how to hold the chalk and make marks on the slate. His first attempts were clumsy, his fine motor control less developed than his gross movements. But he persisted, with remarkable determination. By midday, he had mastered drawing simple vertical and horizontal lines. Widow Porter guided his hand to form the letter E, explaining it was the first letter of his name. Ethan traced the shape repeatedly. His focus absolute. "Remarkable," Doc Simmons commented as they observed from a distance. "The human drive for communication remains intact despite years without language." As the lesson continued, dark clouds began gathering over the mountains, suggesting an approaching storm. Thunder rumbled in the distance, causing Ethan to look up sharply, his expression suddenly anxious. "Just thunder," Thomas reassured him. "Storm coming in." Ethan's anxiety didn't abate. If anything, it increased as the thunder grew louder and more frequent. His hand trembled, making the chalk scrape erratically across the slate. When a particularly loud thunderclap sounded directly overhead, he dropped the slate entirely and darted to Thomas's side, pressing against the hunter's leg like a frightened animal. "He's terrified," Widow Porter observed with concern. "Many children fear storms, but this seems extreme." Thomas placed a steadying hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Maybe we should continue inside," he suggested, gesturing toward the cabin as rain began to fall in heavy drops. They hurried inside just as the downpour intensified. Ethan paced the small cabin anxiously, flinching at each thunderclap. His behavior had regressed noticeably, more animal than human in his movement and distress. "Ethan," Thomas called softly, trying to break through the boy's fear. "You're safe here." The child either didn't hear or couldn't process the reassurance. His agitation increased as lightning flashed, illuminating the cabin interior with stark, white light. When thunder crashed immediately after, Ethan dropped to the floor and crawled beneath Thomas's bed, curling into a tight ball with his hands over his ears. "This isn't just fear of the storm," Doc Simmons observed. "It's triggering something specific." Thomas knelt beside the bed, peering at the trembling child underneath. "Ethan," he called gently. "What is it? What are you remembering?" For a moment, there was no response beyond continued trembling. Then, with obvious effort, Ethan forced out a single word. "Bang! Bang!" Thomas repeated, confused. "The thunder sounds like banging?" Ethan shook his head violently, frustration evident in his expression. He made a motion with his hand, extending his index finger and jerking his hand upward repeatedly. Understanding dawned in Widow Porter's eyes. "He's mimicking firing a gun," she said quietly. "The thunder reminds him of gunshots." The implication was immediate and sobering. If Ethan had indeed survived a wagon train massacre, he had likely witnessed his family's murder by gunfire. The thunder wasn't merely frightening, it was recreating the sound of the most traumatic event of his life. Thomas sat on the floor beside the bed, making no attempt to force Ethan out. "The wagon train," he said softly. "You remember what happened. The bad men with guns." Ethan's eyes, visible in the shadows beneath the bed, filled with tears. He nodded once, a jerky movement that conveyed both confirmation and renewed grief. "Your mama told you to hide," Thomas continued, piecing together what likely occurred based on the territorial report and Ethan's reactions. "You played dead while the bad men hurt everyone." Another nod, accompanied by a whimper that was heartbreakingly human. "And afterward, the wolves found you. They didn't hurt you, they took you with them." Ethan's breathing had begun to slow, his focus on Thomas's gentle narration seemingly helping him separate past from present. He emerged slightly from beneath the bed, no longer in a tight ball, but still seeking the security of the sheltered space. "You were so brave," Thomas told him, his voice thick with emotion. "So brave to survive that. And the wolves were good to you, weren't they? They became your new family when you lost your first one." At the mention of the wolves, Ethan's expression shifted from fear to something more complex, a mixture of longing and gratitude that suggested his feelings for his wolf family ran deep. "Wolf," he said suddenly, the word clear despite his limited speech. "Mother wolf." The adults exchanged glances, recognizing the significance of this linguistic breakthrough. In his distress, Ethan had accessed language more fluently than before. "She took care of you," Thomas acknowledged. "Like your human mother would have wanted." Ethan nodded, then made a pained sound. "Dead," he managed, the word barely intelligible but its meaning unmistakable. "Mother wolf dead." The story emerged in fragments as the storm continued outside, not in fluent narrative but in single words, gestures and expressions that the adults pieced together with gentle questions. "The mother wolf killed defending the pack against a mountain lion. The other wolves dispersed afterward. Ethan left alone until Thomas found him. By the time the storm passed and sunlight broke through the clouds, Ethan had revealed more of his history than in all the previous days combined. The traumatic trigger of the thunder had paradoxically opened a channel to his memories and language that might otherwise have remained blocked for much longer. "You've had enough for today," Thomas told him as the boy's eyelids began to droop, exhausted following his emotional breakthrough. "Rest now." Ethan didn't argue, curling onto his pallet near the fireplace and falling almost immediately into sleep, emotionally spent from the memories he had confronted. Once certain the boy was sleeping soundly, the adults stepped outside to discuss what they had learned. "The territorial report matches his account," Doc Simmons noted. "A wagon train ambushed in the high passes. No reported survivors because the search party arrived weeks later after Ethan had been taken by the wolves." "Those poor people, widow," Porter murmured, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "And that poor child, witnessing such horror at such a tender age." "The miracle isn't just that he survived physically," Thomas observed, watching the cabin where Ethan slept. "It's that something of his humanity survived as well. He could have lost himself completely in the wilderness, become truly feral. Instead, he preserved some core of the human child he had been." "The question now," Doc Simmons said pragmatically, "is what happens next. He's making remarkable progress, but his needs are complex. He requires specialized education, consistent support, resources beyond what our small settlement can easily provide." "Are you suggesting sending him away?" Thomas asked sharply, the idea clearly distressing him. The doctor raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm merely considering all options for his welfare. Sacramento or San Francisco would have educators experienced with special cases." "He's not a special case," Thomas objected. "He's a boy who's survived unimaginable circumstances, and he's just beginning to trust humans again. Sending him to strangers in a crowded city would undo everything he's gained." Widow Porter stepped between the men, her expression thoughtful. "Perhaps there's a middle path. I have a colleague in Sacramento, Elizabeth Hargrove. She studied abnormal psychology in Boston before coming west. She might be willing to consult without removing Ethan from familiar surroundings." This compromise seemed to satisfy both men. The doctor agreed to compose a letter to Ms. Hargrove, explaining Ethan's situation and requesting her expertise, while Thomas would continue providing the boy a stable home environment. "And I'll continue his lessons," Widow Porter added firmly. "That child has a keen mind beneath his limitations. With proper guidance, he could recover far more function than most would expect." As they finalized these plans, a sound from the cabin drew their attention. Ethan stood in the doorway, sleep-tousled but calm. His expression as he regarded the three adults suggested he understood they were discussing his future, even if he couldn't follow the specific words. "Come here, Ethan," Thomas called gently. The boy walked toward them with increasing steadiness in his upright gait, another sign of his rapid reintegration to human movement patterns. When he reached Thomas, he did something unprecedented. He deliberately took the hunter's hand on his own, a distinctly human gesture of trust and connection. "We're figuring out how to help you," Thomas explained, squeezing the small hand gently. "How to teach you more words and writing and everything you'll need." Ethan nodded solemnly, then spoke with careful deliberation, forming each word with visible effort. "Stay with Thomas." It was the longest sentence he had yet produced, and its meaning was unmistakable. Whatever plans the adults made for his rehabilitation, Ethan had formed his own attachment. After years with his wolf family and then alone, he had chosen Thomas Reed as his human anchor. "Yes," Thomas assured him, an unexpected emotion making his voice rough. "You'll stay with me for as long as you want." The declaration sealed a bond that had been forming since that first encounter on the mountainside. Thomas Reed, who had sought solitude in the wilderness, and Ethan Miller, who had survived 7 years without human contact, had somehow become what each other needed, family forged by circumstance rather than blood. As the afternoon sun bathed the clearing in golden light, Widow Porter resumed Ethan's lesson with the slate and chalk. His progress had accelerated noticeably after the emotional breakthrough of the storm. He now formed letters with growing confidence, copying simple words. The widow wrote for him, cat, dog, sun, tree. When she wrote wolf, Ethan traced the letters with particular care, then added a simple drawing beside it, a crude but recognizable wolf figure. Beneath it, he laboriously wrote what might have been intended as mother, though the spelling was creative and the letters uneven. "That's very good, Ethan," Widow Porter praised, genuine admiration in her voice. "You're remembering how to write." Ethan nodded, a small smile lifting the corners of his mouth. Perhaps his first genuine smile since Thomas had found him. It transformed his face, making him look suddenly, heartbreakingly, like an ordinary child rather than a wild creature struggling to become human again. That smile, brief though it was, gave Thomas hope that Ethan's journey back from the wilderness might indeed be possible. The boy had survived physical dangers that would have killed most adults. He had adapted to life among wolves, learning their ways and language. Now he faced perhaps his greatest challenge, remembering how to be human while carrying the burden of all he had witnessed and lost. As dusk settled over the clearing and fireflies began to emerge from the forest edge, Ethan pointed excitedly at the glowing insects. "Light bugs," he said, the words coming more easily than before. "That's right," Thomas confirmed. "Fireflies. Want to catch some?" What followed was a scene that would have seemed impossible just days earlier, a formerly feral child laughing. As he chased fireflies through the twilight, cupping them gently in his hands to observe their glow before releasing them. His movements still held echoes of his wolf upbringing in their fluid efficiency, but the joy in his expression was purely human. Watching from the cabin porch, Doc Simmons shook his head in wonderment. "If I hadn't witnessed this transformation myself, I wouldn't have believed it possible," he admitted. "The resilience of the human spirit is truly remarkable." Thomas nodded in agreement, but his thoughts went deeper. Ethan's survival wasn't just about resilience. It spoke to something fundamental about what made humans human, something that had survived in this child despite years without human language, customs, or community. Whatever that essential quality was, Thomas silently vowed to nurture it, to help Ethan reclaim not just the skills of humanity, but its joys as well. The boy had survived a journey between worlds that few could imagine. Now he deserved the chance to find his place in the human world on his own terms, carrying with him the strength and wisdom his extraordinary life had forged. As night fell completely and the fireflies faded, Ethan returned to Thomas's side, exhaustion evident in his drooping shoulders. Without prompting, he reached for the hunter's hand again, leading him toward the cabin door with clear intent. It was time to rest, to process all that had happened, to prepare for whatever tomorrow might bring. Inside, by the gentle light of a single lantern, Thomas helped Ethan settle onto his pallet. The boy's eyes were already closing when he suddenly reached out, grasping Thomas's sleeve. "Thank you," he said clearly, the words coming as naturally as if he'd been speaking all along. "For finding me." Thomas swallowed hard against unexpected emotion. "You're welcome, Ethan. Now get some sleep. We have a big day tomorrow." As the boy drifted into slumber, Thomas remained beside him, watching the peaceful rise and fall of his chest. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, its haunting cry a reminder of the wilderness from which Ethan had emerged. Somewhere in those mountains, the spirit of the mother wolf who had saved and raised a human child seemed to linger, a bridge between worlds that had made this miracle possible. Thomas silently thanked that unknown wolf, recognizing that his role in Ethan's life was a continuation of what she had begun, protecting a child who moved between worlds, helping him find his way home. The arrival of Elizabeth Hargrove from Sacramento 3 weeks later marked a new chapter in Ethan's journey. The specialist traveled for 5 days by stagecoach and horseback to reach Pine Ridge, her reputation for intellectual brilliance and unconventional methods preceding her. Unlike the prim and proper Widow Porter, Miss Hargrove was a woman of striking appearance and modern ideas. Her dark hair was cut shorter than was fashionable, her traveling clothes practical rather than decorative, and her direct gaze suggested a mind uncluttered by the social niceties that often hindered frontier interactions. Thomas had prepared Ethan for the visitor, explaining that Miss Hargrove had special knowledge that might help him regain more of his human abilities. The boy had nodded solemnly, then returned to the picture book he was studying, evidence of his growing comfort with quiet concentration, a marked change from his perpetual vigilance of earlier weeks. When the specialist arrived at the cabin, her approach was refreshingly straightforward. Rather than treating Ethan as a curiosity or a patient, she addressed him directly after introductions. "Hello, Ethan," she said, crouching to his eye level without invading his personal space. "I'm Elizabeth. Dr. Simmons tells me you lived with wolves for several years. That must have been quite an education." The respect implicit in her tone, acknowledging his wolf years as valuable experience rather than merely a tragedy to overcome, seemed to resonate with the boy. He studied her with that penetrating gaze that Thomas had come to recognize as Ethan's way of assessing new people. "Wolves taught," he replied after a moment, his speech still halting but increasingly coherent. "Different things." "I imagine they did," Elizabeth agreed. "Would you be willing to show me some of what you learned? I've studied animal behavior, but never had the opportunity to learn from someone who lived among wolves." This approach, positioning Ethan as the expert with knowledge to share rather than merely a subject to be studied, immediately established a different dynamic than the boy had experienced with other adults. Thomas watched with interest as Ethan's demeanor shifted subtly from cautious acceptance to cautious engagement. Over the following days, Elizabeth's unconventional methods revealed their effectiveness. Rather than focusing exclusively on returning Ethan to human norms, she created exchanges where his unique experiences were valued. She asked him to demonstrate wolf communication, the various vocalizations and body postures that conveyed messages within the pack. She documented his descriptions of wolf hunting strategies, social hierarchies, and seasonal adaptations. "Most fascinating," she commented to Thomas after one such session. "His observations align with scientific studies of wolf behavior, but include nuances only an insider could know. The scientific community would benefit tremendously from his knowledge." "He's not a research subject," Thomas reminded her. "Protective of Ethan's dignity." "Quite the opposite," Elizabeth corrected. "He could be a respected contributor to scientific understanding, provided he develops the communication skills to share his insights." This framing gave purpose to Ethan's language lessons. Rather than learning to speak and write merely to conform to human expectations, he was acquiring tools to translate his unique knowledge for others. The motivation proved powerful. Within days of Elizabeth's arrival, Ethan's vocabulary expanded dramatically. His sentences grew more complex, his pronunciation more precise. Most striking was his rapid progress with writing. What began as crude letters on a slate evolved into recognizable words, then simple sentences. By the end of Elizabeth's second week at the cabin, Ethan was keeping a rudimentary journal where he recorded observations about wildlife around the cabin, comparing their behaviors to wolves he had known. "His cognitive abilities are extraordinary," Elizabeth told the small council that had formed around Ethan's care. Thomas, Doc Simmons, Widow Porter, and Sheriff Blackwood. "This isn't merely a recovery of the previous function. He's demonstrating intellectual growth beyond what would be expected for his age, even without his unusual history." "But his social development remains delayed," Widow Porter pointed out. He still struggles with basic conventions of human interaction, as do many children raised in conventional environments, Elizabeth countered, and many adults, for that matter. Social conventions are learned behaviors, not innate capabilities. Ethan is acquiring them at a remarkable pace, given his starting point. The most significant breakthrough came unexpectedly during Ethan's third week with Elizabeth. They had established a routine of morning lessons, followed by afternoon excursions into the forest surrounding Thomas's cabin. During these walks, Ethan would often demonstrate skills he had learned from the wolves: how to move silently through dense underbrush, how to track small game by scent, and how to identify which trees might harbor honeybee colonies. On this particular afternoon, they encountered fresh bear tracks crossing a stream. Ethan immediately crouched to examine them, his movements fluid, in a way that still sometimes startled Thomas, a reminder of the wolf child within the increasingly human boy. "Female," Ethan announced after studying the tracks. "With cubs." He pointed to smaller impressions partially overlapping the adult. "Prints, how recently did they pass?" Elizabeth asked, notebook in hand. Ethan considered, sniffing the air in a behavior that once seemed purely animal, but now represented a deliberate application of his specialized knowledge. "Before it rains," he decided. "Yesterday." Thomas nodded in agreement with this assessment, impressed, as always, by the boy's tracking abilities. Elizabeth made notes, asking follow-up questions about how Ethan had determined the bear's sex and the presence of cubs from the tracks alone. As they continued their walk, following the stream back toward the cabin, Ethan suddenly stopped. His posture changed instantly, weight centered, head slightly lowered, every muscle alert in a way Thomas recognized from their first encounters on the mountain. "What is it?" the hunter asked quietly, reaching for his rifle. Ethan didn't answer immediately, his attention fixed on a dense thicket ahead. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Men. Hiding." Thomas tensed, scanning the area. Ethan had indicated. He saw nothing unusual, but he had learned to trust the boy's heightened senses. "How many?" he whispered. "3, Ethan replied with certainty. "Smell metal. Guns." Elizabeth had gone very still, her scientific curiosity replaced by appropriate caution. "Bandits," she mouthed silently to Thomas. The hunter gave a slight nod. The mountain passes occasionally attracted outlaws, evading authorities in more settled regions. Most avoided confrontation with locals, preferring to prey on traveling parties or isolated homesteads. But 3 armed men hiding near the trail suggested deliberate ambush rather than chance encounter. Thomas motioned for Ethan and Elizabeth to retreat quietly. They had taken only a few steps when a voice called from the thicket. "That's far enough, folks. Just stand easy, and nobody gets hurt." 3 men emerged from concealment, each holding a rifle trained on the small group. Their appearance confirmed Thomas's suspicions: trail-worn clothing, unshaven faces, the hard eyes of men accustomed to violence. The leader, a tall man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, gestured with his weapon. "Hand over any valuables, and we'll be on our way," he demanded. "Money, jewelry, that fine rifle you're carrying." Thomas calculated their options, finding none favorable. He might get off one shot before being gunned down, leaving Ethan and Elizabeth defenseless. Cooperation seemed the only reasonable choice. "We don't carry valuables on forest walks," he replied evenly, keeping his hands visible. "But you're welcome to what little we have." The leader's expression hardened. "Don't play games, old man. The woman's wearing a gold necklace, and that's a quality weapon you're holding. Hand them over, nice and slow." Thomas began to comply, carefully lowering his rifle. Beside him, Ethan had gone completely still. Not with fear, the hunter realized, but with a predator's perfect stillness before action. Before Thomas could caution him against any rash movement, the boy let out a sound that froze everyone in place. It wasn't human, not a word or even a scream. It was a wolf's howl, pitched with such perfect mimicry that it seemed to emanate from a much larger creature. The sound echoed through the forest, bouncing off the surrounding hills in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint its source. The bandits exchanged nervous glances. "Shut that kid up," the leader ordered, gesturing threateningly with his rifle. Instead of stopping, Ethan modulated his howl, changing the pitch and pattern in what Thomas recognized as specific wolf communication. The boy was calling for help, using the language of his wolf family. "I said shut him up," the leader repeated, taking a menacing step forward. What happened next occurred so quickly that later accounts would differ in their details. As the bandit advanced, Ethan dropped to all fours and darted forward with blinding speed, directly toward the man's legs. Startled, the bandit fired his rifle, the shot going wide as Ethan collided with his knees, sending him crashing to the ground. In the moment of confusion, Thomas raised his rifle and fired at the second bandit, striking him in the shoulder. Elizabeth, proving herself more capable than her academic background might suggest, hurled a heavy rock at the third man with remarkable accuracy, catching him in the temple and momentarily stunning him. A chaotic struggle ensued. Thomas grappled with the wounded bandit while Elizabeth seized the fallen leader's rifle. Ethan, moving with the fluid grace of a predator, darted between the men, creating confusion and preventing them from coordinating their defense. Just as the tide seemed to turn in their favor, the third bandit recovered sufficiently to level his weapon at Thomas. Before he could fire, a blur of grey fur burst from the underbrush, slamming into his back with the force of a boulder. The man screamed as powerful jaws closed around his gun arm, forcing him to drop his weapon. A wolf, large and battle-scarred, had answered Ethan's call. Seconds later, two more wolves emerged from different directions, circling the humans with measured steps and bared teeth. The bandits, faced with both armed humans and predators, quickly surrendered. Elizabeth kept them covered with the captured rifle, while Thomas bound their hands with leather straps from his pack. Throughout this process, Ethan communicated with the wolves through a series of soft vocalizations and body postures. The largest wolf, clearly the alpha of this small pack, maintained a position near the boy, occasionally touching noses with him in what appeared to be a greeting between equals. "They remember you," Thomas observed with wonder. Ethan nodded, a complex emotion playing across his increasingly expressive face. "Not Mother's pack," he explained. "Different wolves, but they know me as wolf-kind." The revelation was astonishing. Ethan's connection to wolves extended beyond the specific pack that had raised him. Somehow, his years living as one of them had marked him in ways other wolves could recognize and respect. With the bandits secured, Thomas sent Elizabeth back to the cabin to fetch Sheriff Blackwood while he guarded the prisoners. The wolves remained, keeping a watchful perimeter around Thomas and Ethan, their presence ensuring the bandits made no attempt to escape their bonds. "How did you know they would come?" Thomas asked as they waited. Ethan considered the question carefully. His vocabulary had expanded tremendously under Elizabeth's tutelage, but he still chose words with deliberate precision. "Wolf territories overlap here," he explained. "Many packs hunt these valleys. They answer calls if it means prey or danger." "And they recognized your call as one of their own?" The boy nodded. "I still speak wolf. They understand." It was perhaps the most profound demonstration yet of Ethan's dual nature, human enough to understand the bandits' threat, wolf enough to summon aid from the wilderness. He existed at the intersection of two worlds, carrying the knowledge and instincts of both. When Sheriff Blackwood arrived with two deputies, he found an extraordinary scene. 3 bound outlaws guarded by a man, a boy, and 3 wolves that showed no fear of the humans they had apparently allied with. "I've been in this territory 15 years, the sheriff remarked as his men took custody of the prisoners, "and I've never seen the like." As the lawmen prepared to depart with their prisoners, Ethan approached the wolves one by one, communing with them through subtle gestures and soft sounds. The alpha wolf remained longest, touching his nose to Ethan's forehead in what seemed a gesture of blessing before leading his small pack back into the forest. "Will they stay nearby?" Thomas asked, as they watched the wolves disappear among the trees. Ethan shook his head. "They have their own hunting grounds, but they will remember if I call again." The incident transformed Ethan's status within the small community. Word spread quickly of how the wolf boy had summoned wild predators to defend against bandits. Some accounts grew exaggerated in the telling, but even the most basic facts were remarkable enough. A child once thought Feral had used his unique abilities to protect his human companions. More significantly, the experience seemed to accelerate Ethan's integration of his dual identity. Rather than abandoning his wolf-learned skills in favor of human conventions, he began deliberately combining them, creating a unique perspective that bridged natural and civilized worlds. Elizabeth documented this process with scientific precision, taking particular interest in how Ethan's sensory abilities, enhanced by his years in the wild, influenced his learning style. He struggled with abstract concepts when presented solely through words, but grasped them immediately when embodied in natural examples. Mathematical principles that confused him on a slate became clear when demonstrated through patterns in pine cones, or the symmetry of snowflakes. "He's developing a hybrid intelligence," Elizabeth explained to the council one evening. "Not half human and half wolf, but something entirely new, a synthesis that draws on the strengths of both experiences." The implications extended beyond Ethan's individual case. With Elizabeth's guidance, he began recording detailed observations of wolf behavior that challenged existing scientific understanding. His descriptions of complex pack communications, cooperative hunting strategies, and territorial negotiations revealed sophistication that most researchers had failed to recognize in their limited observations. "This boy could revolutionize our understanding of animal behavior," Elizabeth declared. "And not just regarding wolves. His perspective calls into question our entire framework for differentiating human and animal intelligence." Thomas listened to these academic discussions with mixed feelings. He valued the recognition of Ethan's unique gifts, but worried about the boy becoming defined by his unusual history. "He's still a child who deserves a childhood," he reminded the others, "not just a research subject or a curiosity." Elizabeth acknowledged this concern with unexpected warmth. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Reed. Scientific interest must never overshadow his welfare and development as an individual. That's why what you provide is so essential: a home, stability, unconditional acceptance." 6 months after Thomas had first discovered Ethan on the mountainside, the boy had progressed beyond anyone's expectations. He spoke in complete sentences, read simple books independently, and wrote daily in his journal. His social skills remained somewhat unconventional. He still occasionally dropped to all fours when excited or startled, and he preferred sleeping on the floor rather than a bed. But these behaviors were decreasing in frequency. More importantly, he had begun forming friendships with other children. Widow Porter had carefully introduced him to her students, beginning with individual interactions and gradually incorporating him into small group activities. Initial curiosity about the wolf boy gave way to genuine connection as the children discovered Ethan's extraordinary knowledge of the natural world. "He showed us how to find honey without getting stung," 8-year-old Samuel Jenkins reported excitedly to his parents. "And he can tell which bird is singing without even looking at it." These social successes represented perhaps the most meaningful aspect of Ethan's recovery. Beyond language acquisition or academic progress, his growing comfort with human relationships suggested healing from the profound loss that had driven him into the wilderness. Yet there remained a wildness in him, not as a deficit, but as a gift. On full moon nights, Thomas often found Ethan sitting outside the cabin, face tilted toward the sky, listening to distant wolf howls with an expression of peaceful recognition. In these moments, the hunter made no attempt to bring the boy inside or redirect his attention. Some connections transcended the boundaries between human and wild, and Ethan's bond with the wolves deserved respect. As autumn painted the forest in brilliant hues of red and gold, Elizabeth Hargrove prepared to return to Sacramento. Her 3-month stay had extended to 6, then 8, as Ethan's progress continually revealed new avenues for exploration. But professional obligations called her back to the city, where she hoped to secure funding for a more comprehensive study of children with unusual developmental histories. "I've arranged for regular correspondence," she told Thomas as they sat on the cabin porch, watching Ethan construct an elaborate lean-to based on both human logging techniques and wolf den building principles. "Widow Porter will continue his formal education, and I'll return next summer to assess his progress." "He'll miss you," Thomas observed. "You've given him words for things he already knew but couldn't express." Elizabeth smiled, her academic reserve softening. "He's given me far more, a new framework for understanding intelligence itself. But what you've given him, Mr. Reed, is most valuable of all, a place to belong again." The observation struck Thomas deeply. He had never intended to become a father figure, particularly not to a child with such extraordinary needs. Yet somewhere, between their first encounter on the mountain and now, Ethan had become the center of his previously solitary existence. On her final evening in Pine Ridge, Elizabeth shared her formal recommendations with the council that had overseen Ethan's rehabilitation. Her assessment was both professional and deeply personal. "Ethan Miller represents a unique case in documented history," she began. "While other feral children have been discovered throughout the centuries, none have shown his capacity for reintegration with human society while retaining the valuable aspects of their wild experience." She presented her conclusions with methodical clarity. Ethan should remain with Thomas Reed, who had proven the ideal guardian for his unique needs. His education should continue under Widow Porter's guidance, supplemented by specialized materials Elizabeth would send from Sacramento. Most significantly, his connection to the wilderness should be honored rather than suppressed, allowing him to maintain the wolf-taught skills that had saved his life and now enriched his perspective. In essence, she concluded, Ethan doesn't need to choose between being human or being wild. His extraordinary journey has made him both, and we would do well to learn from the wisdom that synthesis has produced. As the meeting concluded and the adults began to disperse, Sheriff Blackwood lingered to share a final piece of information with Thomas. "Got confirmation from territorial authorities," he said quietly. "Those bandits we captured were identified as members of the Hawkins gang. They've been terrorizing these mountains for years, responsible for at least 3 wagon train massacres." Thomas absorbed this news with growing understanding. "Including the one that killed Ethan's family?" The sheriff nodded grimly. "Their leader, the one with the scarred eyebrow, was positively identified by a survivor from another attack. His name is James Hawkins. He's wanted for multiple murders across 3 territories. Does Ethan know?" "Not yet. Thought you should be the one to decide when and how to tell him." Thomas thanked the sheriff for his discretion, his mind racing with implications. The men who had orphaned Ethan, who had sent him fleeing into the wilderness and his extraordinary life among wolves, had unwittingly encountered their victim years later. And through the very skills Ethan had gained from his wolf family, they had finally been brought to justice. It was a circle closed, though Thomas questioned whether this knowledge would bring Ethan peace or reopen wounds barely beginning to heal. For now, he decided to keep the information to himself, watching the boy who had traveled between worlds, human child, wolf survivor, and now something uniquely himself, as he mapped his own constellations in the darkening sky. Winter settled over the mountains, blanketing Thomas's cabin and the surrounding forest in pristine white. For Ethan, the season brought new challenges and discoveries as he experienced his first human winter after years of surviving the cold with his wolf family. Thomas taught him to maintain the cabin's warmth, to preserve food for leaner months, and to navigate snowdrifts on the snowshoes the hunter had crafted specially for him. The question of whether to tell Ethan about the bandits' connection to his family's massacre weighed heavily on Thomas's mind. After much contemplation, he sought counsel from Widow Porter, whose insight into children's emotional development had proven invaluable. "The truth often hurts less than uncertainty," she advised during one of her twice-weekly visits to continue Ethan's lessons. "He has fragments of memory about that day. Knowing those responsible have faced justice might help him make peace with it." Thomas nodded, accepting her wisdom. That evening, as they sat before the fireplace after dinner, he broached the subject. "Carefully, Ethan, remember the men we captured in the forest? Sheriff Blackwood has learned something about them that you should know." The boy looked up from the book he'd been reading, a volume on North American wildlife Elizabeth had sent from Sacramento. His gaze was steady, his expression open, but guarded. "They were part of a group called the Hawkins Gang," Thomas continued. "Gently, they've attacked many travelers in these mountains over the years. Sheriff Blackwood believes they were the same men who hurt your family on the wagon train." Ethan went very still, processing this information with the focused intensity that characterized his thinking. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but clear. "The men with guns, the ones who made the thunder sound?" "Yes," Thomas confirmed. "The same ones. They'll be taken to Sacramento for trial, and they won't hurt anyone else." Ethan stared into the fire, his expression unreadable. After a long silence, he asked, "Did they know who I was?" "No," Thomas assured him. "They had no idea they were facing someone who had survived their attack years ago." The boy nodded slowly, then made a statement that revealed the depth of his understanding. "The wolves saved me twice. First when the mother wolf found me after the guns, then they came when I called." The observation struck Thomas with its profound truth. Without the wolves, both the mother who had adopted him and the pack that had responded to his call, Ethan would not have survived. His life had been preserved through an alliance between species that most humans would consider impossible. "You're right," Thomas agreed. "The wilderness that most people fear became your protection." Ethan's next question came unexpectedly. "Will I see their trial?" Thomas hadn't considered this possibility. "Do you want to?" The boy thought carefully before answering. "I want them to see me, to know I lived, that the wolves were stronger than their guns." The request revealed a need for closure that Thomas hadn't anticipated, but immediately recognized as important. He promised to speak with Sheriff Blackwood about arrangements for Ethan to attend the proceedings in Sacramento when spring made travel possible. As winter deepened, Ethan's integration of his dual nature continued in surprising ways. His journal entries evolved to include both carefully formed English sentences and intricate drawings of wolf postures, with notations about their meanings. He developed a system for translating wolf communication concepts into human language, creating a bridge between worlds that had previously been considered unbridgeable. Widow Porter incorporated these insights into his formal education, allowing Ethan to approach conventional subjects through his unique perspective. Mathematical concepts became clearer when related to pack hunting formations. History took on new meaning when considered through the lens of territorial behaviors and resource competition. Rather than forcing Ethan to abandon his wolf-learned frameworks, she helped him use them as foundations for building human knowledge. By the time snow began to recede from the lower slopes, Ethan had progressed academically to a level appropriate. For his age, a remarkable achievement given his starting point less than a year earlier. More significantly, he had begun forming his own identity, neither fully defined by his human origins nor his wolf upbringing, but incorporating elements of both into something uniquely his own. Spring brought the promised journey to Sacramento. For the Hawkins gang trial, Thomas, Ethan, and Sheriff Blackwood traveled for 6 days, the boys' excitement about his first visit to a city tempered by the serious purpose of their trip. Elizabeth Hargrove met them upon arrival, having arranged accommodations and prepared officials for Ethan's unusual background. The territorial court was imposing, a stone building with formal chambers where judges in black robes presided over proceedings with solemn authority. Ethan observed everything with keen attention, whispering occasional questions to Thomas about unfamiliar concepts and protocols. When James Hawkins and his remaining gang members were brought in, Ethan went completely still, his posture subtly shifting into the alert stance Thomas recognized from their first encounters. The leader's scarred eyebrow had become a defining feature in the boy's nightmares, though he had been too young during the massacre to consciously remember individual faces. The proceedings were relatively brief. Multiple charges of murder, robbery, and assault were read. Evidence was presented, including testimony from other attack survivors. Throughout, Hawkins maintained a stony expression, showing neither remorse nor concern for his likely fate. Near the conclusion, the prosecutor made an unusual request. Your Honor, we have a survivor from the Miller Wagon train massacre present in court today. While he was too young at the time to provide testimony, we requested permission for him to be recognized in these proceedings. The judge, after brief consideration, granted the request. Thomas gently guided Ethan to stand beside the prosecutor's table, a hand on his shoulder providing silent support. This is Ethan Miller, the prosecutor announced. He was 6 years old when the defendants attacked his family's wagon train, killing his parents and the other travelers. Ethan survived by playing dead among the bodies until the killers left. He was then taken in and raised by a wolf pack until being discovered last year. A murmur ran through the courtroom at this extraordinary statement. James Hawkins, for the first time, showed emotion, his face paling as he stared at the boy he had presumed dead years ago. Ethan stood straight, his gaze steady as he faced the man responsible for orphaning him. No words were exchanged, none were needed. The simple fact of his presence, a living testament to survival against impossible odds, spoke more powerfully than any testimony could have. When the judge delivered the expected verdict and sentence, hanging for Hawkins and life, imprisonment for his accomplices, Ethan showed no visible reaction. His purpose had been fulfilled not by their punishment, but by the acknowledgement of his own existence, his own journey. Outside the courthouse, Elizabeth asked him gently, "How do you feel now, Ethan?" The boy considered the question with his characteristic thoughtfulness. "Like closing a den that's no longer needed," he replied. "The past is still there, but I don't have to live in it anymore." The wisdom in his response struck all the adults present. This child, who had moved between human and wild worlds, understood something about closure and moving forward that many adults never grasped. The remainder of their time in Sacramento was devoted to more pleasant experiences. Elizabeth introduced Ethan to colleagues at the university, where his unique insights into wolf behavior generated tremendous interest. Thomas watched with pride as the boy articulated complex concepts about pack dynamics that challenged established scientific understanding. More personally meaningful was their visit to a small cemetery on the city's outskirts. Research had confirmed that after the massacre was discovered, the recovered bodies of the Miller family, minus Ethan, presumed taken by predators, had been brought to Sacramento for proper burial. Standing before the simple markers for Jacob and Sarah Miller, Ethan placed wildflowers he had gathered himself. "I remember them a little now," he told Thomas quietly. "Father's voice, mother's hands, not much else." "That's enough," Thomas assured him. "They're part of who you are, just like the wolves. You carry them with you." The journey back to Pine Ridge was marked by a new serenity in Ethan's demeanor. Having confronted both his human past and his wolf-shaped present, he seemed ready to embrace whatever future might unfold. He spoke more freely about his memories, both painful and precious, as if integrating all aspects of his extraordinary life. 1 year to the day after Thomas first spotted Ethan on the rocky ridge, they returned to the cave where the boy had lived alone after his wolf mother's death. The purpose was both practical, retrieving any remaining items that might have personal significance, and symbolic, a way for Ethan to consciously transition from one chapter of his life to another. The cave appeared smaller than Thomas remembered, its entrance partially obscured by spring growth. Ethan approached it with calm familiarity, dropping naturally to all fours to enter the low opening, Thomas following with more difficulty. Inside, little remained of Ethan's solitary habitation. A few bones from meals long past, a collection of interesting stones and feathers, a tattered remnant of what might have once been his clothing from the wagon train. The boy gathered the stones and feathers into a pouch Thomas had brought, but left the other items untouched. "Don't need these anymore," he explained simply. As they prepared to leave, a sound from outside drew their attention. Ethan froze, then smiled, a full, joyful expression that transformed his serious face. "Listen," he whispered. A wolf's howl echoed through the valley, then another and another. A pack was passing through, their voices calling to one another across the distance. Ethan stepped outside the cave and lifted his face to the sky. Without hesitation, he answered their call, his young voice producing the haunting howl with perfect pitch and modulation. The wolves fell silent briefly, then responded with what seemed to Thomas like particular intensity. "What did you tell them?" he asked when the exchange ended. Ethan's eyes shone with a complex emotion, joy tinged with nostalgia, gratitude mixed with farewell. "I thanked them. Told them I was well, that I have a new pack now, but I will never forget my first Thomas felt unexpected tears prick his eyes at the simple profundity of this communication. Ethan had found a way to honor both worlds that had shaped him, creating an identity that transcended the boundaries most humans never questioned. As they descended the mountain toward home, for Thomas's cabin had truly become home to them both, Ethan suddenly took the hunter's weathered hand in his smaller one. The gesture, offered freely and without the hesitation that had marked his early human interactions, conveyed more than words could have. "Will I always be wolf boy to people?" he asked thoughtfully. Thomas considered his answer carefully. "You'll always be the boy who lived with wolves," he acknowledged. "That's a remarkable part of your story. But it's only one part. The rest is still being written by you." Ethan nodded, satisfied with this perspective. "Thomas," he said after a moment, using the name he now pronounced clearly, "I think Mother Wolf would be happy that I found you." The simple statement contained a depth of meaning that pierced Thomas's heart. In acknowledging the connection between his two lives, his wolf mother and his human guardian, Ethan had articulated the continuity of care that had sustained him through extraordinary circumstances. I think she would too, Thomas agreed, his voice rough with emotion. She protected you until someone else could. That's what good mothers do, wolf or human. They continued down the trail as afternoon light filtered through new spring leaves, casting dappled shadows across their path. Behind them, the mountain kept its secrets, the tragedy that had orphaned a boy, the miracle of his adoption by wolves, the solitary years of survival that had forged him into something unprecedented. Ahead lay a future neither could have imagined. A year earlier, a life neither fully wild nor conventionally civilized, but deliberately crafted from the wisdom of both worlds. Ethan Miller, once lost between human and wolf existence, had found not just survival, but belonging, creating a bridge across a divide most never recognized existed. And in this belonging, this family formed by circumstance rather than blood. Both the hunter who had sought solitude and the boy who had survived the wilderness discovered something profound, that home isn't defined by species or convention, but by the connections that sustain us through our darkest hours and celebrate our most authentic selves. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.